Awesome, guys. Well, my name is Rick Alexander, and I'm here with Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition and ways to sort of fortify your nutritional experience so that you can hit whatever the physical goals that you're after. And of course, a lot of people that are listening to this, Mike, are people that are in the military world and or paramilitary. And really what we're talking about there is people that are really having to carry load over time. That really is what a lot of the military work is, a lot of endurance stuff, and typically under heavy load, especially when you get into rucksacks and things like that. I was thinking to kick it off, could you give us maybe a little background on just what you do and where you focus your expertise?
Yeah, so right now I do most of my work online. I mean, I do some in-person consulting here, and I converted my garage into a gym and kind of testing place. I got a freezer; it'll be filled with water pretty soon once I can make sure it doesn't leak anymore, and a rower, a bunch of weird weights and stuff, and then a bunch of testing equipment from Moxie that looks at muscle oxygenation levels to a full metabolic cart, looks at how much fuels you use, how much air you use, oxygen, carbon dioxide, that kind of stuff. So for in-person, most of my work is online with clients of, all variety of backgrounds from, top level CrossFit athletes, a few of them, obstacle course racers, mostly trainers, some military people in the past from, some special forces to people just kind of all across the military branches, I guess you could say. And I also teach. I teach online right now for Rocky Mountain University, Georgia Southern University, and then I'm a faculty member at the Carrick Institute that does primarily clinical neuroscience.
Oh, incredible. So you can do all that out of your garage?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy now. It's all the testing, like for years, like my big goal for years was to, because I wanted to work in an academic setting. And I'm like, okay, so why do I want to work there? Oh, because they have cool toys and stuff I can play around with. Yeah, do I really want to be on committees and spend all my time writing for R1 grants? I'm like, no, I'd rather carve my eyeball out of my face with like a dull spoon than like try to do a grant thing.
Right.
And then as technology's gotten better, it's like, oh, I mean, they're not cheap. I mean, the metabolic cart's about $6,000. But compared to the devices I was using in grad school that were $40,000, it's definitely a lot cheaper. There's even, it's called a Butterfly, but it's a device that uses ultrasound now that plugs into your phone. It's about $2,000 and it's pretty darn good for graphics and stuff. The ultrasound machine I used when I was doing my PhD was probably about $130,000 and it was this big unit you had to wheel into the room. So it's getting to the point where technology has made it a lot cheaper than what it was and much more user, I'd say probably easier. I mean, you still have to kind of understand the basic fundamentals of what you're looking at, but the user interface has gotten a lot better too. So yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's cool. So a lot of the populations that you mentioned, I think it's interesting because they really have pulled a lot of what their methodology and a lot of their testing from the military, like especially when you look at CrossFit, of course, Dave Castro,
definitely.
Like, Navy SEALs, he was in there, and then also the obstacle course racing. So for people that are in this world, whether it's paramilitary or not, what kind of testing metrics have you seen that this kind of population can really benefit from? Because I think now we're seeing a lot of biotech that's pretty widespread, and it's hard to tell, does this work? Is this not, is this, what are we really dealing with here? And so as far as people that are looking to just begin learning how to increase their performance from a metric standpoint, what metrics do you think people should be looking at that aren't going to buy the $6,000 cart or be able to work with you in person?
No, totally, because most of my clients are all online, right? Because most people don't have the luxury of showing up here in Minnesota. And so I had to kind of think about, okay, so what can I translate with the same ideas and same principles? How do I translate that to some type of assessment online? And it turns out there's some pretty good metrics for it. You can do video now, which is super easy. Everyone has a phone, so we can get movement quality relatively easy on just basic tests they would do. I'm working with a gal who's trying to max out the new Army test that'll be coming out in October. It may have gotten pushed out a little bit. So with her, obviously, the testing she's going to do, tripod deadlift, things of that nature. We can get videos beforehand. We know exactly what she has to accomplish. And then outside of that, looking at what are kind of rate limiters related to it. You can look at something from Patrick McEwen, wrote the oxygen advantage called the Bolt score, and is trying to give you a proxy of how much carbon dioxide is in your blood at any one time. And it's simply kind of a breath hold test, or Brian McKenzie has some stuff on max exhale, right? So most people, when they think about breathing, they think, oh, it's oxygen. Oxygen is the main regulator of breathing, and it's actually CO2. So if you have a better tolerance to CO2, you can probably hold your breath a little bit longer. And that's kind of a crude metric of aerobic capacity to some degree or not, but it gives us a little bit more idea of what may be a limiter during exercise. And then even going a step further, if they're doing a lot of running, right, pretty common in the military, they can do a 12-minute Cooper run test, go out, flat ground, how far can you run in about 12 minutes? And there's a scales that'll translate that into what's called a Vo2 Max. So Vo2 Max is how much oxygen can you bring through your system via aerobic metabolism. If you have a rower, you can do a 2,000 meter on the rower, which is absolutely just freaking abysmal.
Terrible.
But yeah, it's terrible, right? But that'll also tell you within pretty good metrics what is your Vo2 Max. So if someone is more of a strength power type position or athlete, I'll probably use the rower. If they're doing a lot of running and rucking and things like that, probably use a Cooper run test to be a little bit more specific. If I know they have access to both, I may run both, and that gives us a metric of that. And other things we can look at if we want to go like super far down, if they do have access to a rower, you can look at lactate tolerance. So if I put you on a rower and do what's called a wind gate, so just max all out as hard as you can, typically in the lab it's done on a bike. You can do it on a rower for 30 seconds, gives us an idea of peak power. We can then do that for 60 seconds, and then we can do that for 180 seconds. So 3 minutes, which again, just absolutely abysmal. But what we're looking at there, we're not able to prick your finger and get lactate measurements. We're looking at how well can you hit peak power, and can you kind of sustain that level for at least the next 2 minutes? If you can, your lactate tolerance for that kind of really high end, that kind of anaerobic stuff, the hard, all out stuff for 30 to 180 seconds, you're probably pretty good with that. If you can peak real fast and then you just tank really hard, your ability to function under high levels of lactate is probably a little bit more impaired. So there's different metrics like that we can do, and all the data for the rower you can get through a little app. So I could see your stroke rate, I could see, put a heart rate strap on you. So it's getting to the point where we can get a lot of the data online. People can use their own facilities to get a lot of it. And we've got some good metrics of population standards and where that translates to.
I like the idea of the 12-minute run, because a lot of people in the military are having to do a 1.5-mile run to a 4-mile timed run. And then there'll be some more, there's some longer stuff. So with people that are looking, let's start, and I definitely want to transition to nutrition too at some point. But let's start with, I think, where a lot of people, I spent a while as a BUDS instructor. A lot of people that want to come into that community, their run is one of the things that holds them back. I'd say run and pull-ups probably the two biggest things. Fuck, people mess up the swim too, but I think the run is the swim. You can get there with technique, right? Pull up, you can do it for
very technique dependent.
Yeah, so you can learn that technique and just kind of like Olympic lifting, get a lot stronger without getting any stronger, right? Like you just improve that performance. So, but with the running, people really, even though it's technical, I think it takes a lot longer to build up. And so for people that are looking to build that, let's say to just get a better score on that 12-minute run test, what is the sort of time domain and intensity that they should be probably trying to work in, just to think about it as far as going out and training?
Yeah. So I split it up into two ends, right? This is like bastardized, polarized training. So on one end, I'm thinking ultra high-end technique, right? So if I look at just the running world, like who probably has the most dialed-in technique, probably 100-meter, 200-meter sprinters. Now, again, that doesn't mean if you're going to run 12 minutes that you want to run like a sprinter. But those people, because the distance is so incredibly short, their technique has to be for that sprint 100%, like just bang on. So I will take them with technique stuff, trying to modulate them more like a sprinter, and then I can then kind of shift them down from there to do more endurance. I haven't found going the other way is as efficient, right? Because if I can make them super efficient, and then, yeah, you don't need to do a complete, full arm stroke, for example, if you're running at 12 minutes, but I can tell you, okay, just move your arms like 50% of that. But if you don't have that full range of motion to begin with, it's hard to kind of gradually pull back from there. So that'll automatically tell me what their limiters are from mobility and everything else. And you're just teaching efficiency. And those drills are not very fatiguing either. So you can do a few of those. There's specific ones you can do, and then they can go to kind of a moderate run. So I like, if I have time, which a lot of times you don't, but if I have a fair amount, like several months, I just start very low volume, and I want to make sure that they're very efficient. And if it's online, one of the big cues I get people is it should feel pretty fluid, and it should be relatively quiet. If you're running and you feel like your arms are flailing all over and it sounds like a herd of elephants coming at you, I can guarantee you're not very efficient, and that wear and tear is just going to make your life freaking miserable over time. So if I can make you as efficient as possible, hopefully we'll reduce some of the wear and tear over time. Obviously, your times are going to get faster because of the technique change, and then we're going to work on trying to add some more to your aerobic fitness at the same time. So I'm a big fan of taking shorter distance, making sure they feel really good and competent in that, and then slowly expanding it. Or if I'm really crunched for time, I'll be like, okay, just run, make it feel nice and fluid. We can monitor what their pace is. Okay, and then stop, and then just walk maybe for 5 minutes. Okay, and then let's go again at that pace again. So I'll split it up into smaller blocks to keep that quality as high as possible. And then over time, we'll just reduce that rest period between blocks. Where most people just go out and they're like, hey, bro, I need better at running. I'm just going to go run.
Right.
And yeah, will you definitely get better at that? Absolutely, you will get better. But unfortunately, when you're doing that, a lot of times you're actually making your compensations worse. Now, will you get better, more aerobic fitness? Yeah. Will your times get better? They will up until a point. But I think if you think long term, it's like, yeah, you want to do good on the test. You definitely want to pass. Totally get it. But if we can make you more efficient in that process, it's going to make the rest of your life like just so much easier then too.
Yeah, so many people I think in their early 20s just trade that like quick performance and don't build the foundation up, and they end up screwing themselves in the long run.
Yeah. And I ask people, like, and it's weird, like even, I haven't worked with a lot of, endurance athletes, but even the few I have, I'm like, okay, so you're a runner, like your main deal is running, which is cool. Has anyone ever taught you to run? And it's fascinating how often people are like, no.
Yeah.
And these are people who were, pretty good marathon runners, not elite, but, not bad. I'm like, oh my God, that's so crazy. Because we don't think about that. Like if someone came in and said, hey, bro, I want to learn how to Olympic lift. Yeah, like, okay, you definitely want to work on technique. Just don't grab a bar and stuff it over your head. But for running, we just seem to go, I don't know, just go run. You're okay.
Totally.
That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and I think part of that is almost industry driven, because then, if you're like, okay, I need to get a running shoe, they're like, let me put you on a treadmill, which is going to change your gait anyway.
Absolutely.
And then let me put a cast on your foot to fix the way that you're landing instead of teaching you how to land. So it's, you're chasing your tail with that.
Yeah. And the nice part is too, if I want to get really aggressive and I can watch the person and know that they're not going to completely overdo it, have them go on grass, or if you can take a very short period of time on pavement or asphalt and have them go barefoot, just to see what changes in their mechanics. And a lot of times, because that impact is so hard, again, you don't want to go run barefoot for mileage if you're not used to it. But as a short drill for an awareness, it's very fascinating to watch how they will automatically kind of change a lot of stuff and fix it, because their body is finding ways to kind of minimize that impact too.
Yeah. So many people, I think every stride are slamming on the brakes with that heel strike, and you just won't be able to do that barefoot. That's perfect. Yeah. And I also really like that idea of dialing up intensity by actually not dialing up intensity, but shortening the rest periods. I think that's super beneficial for people. Like you said, I think people just go out and give it hell, and they're not seeing any improvement because there's no real linear progression in there.
Yeah. So if someone doesn't have the ability to do technique, the easiest thing for them to do is like, okay, what do you need to pass your test? I have to run 1.5 miles the next time, or whatever it is they're doing. Okay, let's say it's a 1.5 mile run. Great. Can you run 1 mile at that pace? No. Okay, can you run a half a mile at your qualifying pace? Oh, you can. Great. So your job is to go run a half mile at the pace you need to qualify. Yes, I understand you have to run a mile and a half. And then just take a very long rest period. Can you repeat that? Can you do another half mile at that pace? Oh, cool, you can. All right. Can you maybe get a third? Oh, you kind of fall apart during the third one, right? So I'm a bigger fan of training the quality or the intensity of that. If you want to throw in a few days or just kind of long, slow distance training for aerobic base and development, I think that's fine. I usually will have them do a bike or some other modality so they don't beat themselves up too much. But that's much more effective than, just go out every day and just try to run faster.
Totally. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of people in this space, they're just excited about it. They nerd out on it and they start coaching people on it. And that's cool. But I've rarely talked to people with such a robust academic background. So I'm curious what a couple of things, but one of them is, what do you think about, or what is your opinion on like nasal breathing while working out?
Oh man.
Something that I've seen grow in popularity.
I think it's useful. Now, if you push me really hard and said, hey, what's the research on this and stuff, I'm really on the fence in terms of, does it make a huge physiologic difference? From research, I don't know. I'm in the process of kind of going back to all the original literature and that kind of stuff, because years ago I did all the Buteyko stuff, right, which is kind of the early Russian methods of it, and I really liked a lot of it, and then some of it, like based on physiology, made no sense whatsoever. And then I kind of got away from it, and then I did get Patrick McEwen's book again, which I'm sure people are very familiar with, about 2 years ago, and started doing it again. I initially started doing nasal breathing as a way to limit CrossFit athletes when they were doing work on the rower, because I would put a heart rate monitor on them, and they wanted to turn everything into like a balls out, like Metcon type thing. And so then I got wise and said, okay, you're actually only going to breathe through your nose when you do this. So what you're going to do is you're going to limit that kind of top end performance, because I wanted it to be more of an aerobic base building. And the first couple of guys who did that, they're just like, oh my God, this is horrible. It's like I'm drowning in air. They're like, I can breathe, but it feels really, really hard. You get into stuff like maybe it's increasing CO2 retention, which may be beneficial if their Bolt score is off and they have a hard time with that. You may be able to use Moxie to kind of look at that, possibly. So overall, I would say, I think it's beneficial. I think it's useful. I think from just a principle-based efficiency thing, every other animal except for humans will breathe through their nose for the most part. Humans are the only animals that will kind of do both. If you look at how we're developed, and I've done some cadaver work where we did a mid-sagittal cut down the middle, and the nasal cavities and that whole space is massive. It's like way bigger than you think that it would be. So from just a first principle, it kind of makes sense that the nose should primarily be used for breathing. And kind of what Brian McKenzie just talked about, that over time during max exercise, will you probably be breathing through your mouth? I would say yes. But I do, from a pure mechanics standpoint, get worried about someone who starts mouth breathing right away. Even like the muscles in the neck, the SCM, the scalene, stuff like that. Those are primarily just all out top end muscles, right? So when your rib cage is maxed out, your diaphragm is doing the best it can. We can hold the head still and yank on those muscles to kind of pull the top part of the rib cage up a little bit more, but they weren't really meant to be used for daily things all the time. So I don't know. I use it with a lot of athletes. I found it's actually in practice been super useful, especially for lower intensity aerobic stuff. I'll put them on a rower and I'll measure kind of what is the max they can get to just nasal breathing. The first time I did this probably 3.5 years ago, I could barely get above 100. I'm like, holy crap, that's bad. Now I can get like 150-ish, 155 maybe. And it doesn't, heart rate, yeah.
Yeah.
And it feels hard, but it's doable on most days. So I do think having that kind of reserve is going to be of benefit overall.
Yeah, totally. Okay, great. It's a great mental toughness exercise
totally.
as well. I think that's maybe what drew me to it at first. And anecdotally, my first 200-mile race was, I had to train at sea level, and then I went and raced it above sea level at like 9,000 feet.
That's brutal.
And it was brutal. I got at mile 87, I got HAPE. I started spitting up blood, and when I talked, it sounded like I was drowning. And but I went through Brian McKenzie's Art of Breath seminar, and so I had really gotten into nasal
Rob Wilson,
breathing.
love those guys.
Yeah. Really gotten into nasal breathing, and I think mostly just because I like that it pushed me into that fat burning state where I'm always go, go, go. And so anyway, I switched to it. I switched to nasal breathing, which slowed me way down in this race. And I ended up managing the HAPE and staying away from the medical staff and so they didn't pull me and getting through it. So like, I haven't been able to figure out necessarily why that would have worked, other than it did, and I finished.
Yeah. I mean, if you read like some of Patrick McEwen's stuff, the main thing they go to is the Bohr Effect, right? So the Bohr Effect is, if you're looking at aerobic capacity at the muscle fiber, it's primarily driven by trying to offload oxygen and to pull away carbon dioxide. And that's based off of a diffusion gradient. So that process is diffusion, which is a passive process. It's done by the different concentration of gases. So with the Moxie, we can put a little sensor on there, and we can look at what is what's called desaturation. So red blood cell comes running by. How many oxygen can you strip off of that red blood cell? In a perfect world, you want to strip off as much as possible, right? So your desaturation is basically almost 100%. And some athletes, like the first time I was tested, I was only at like 35%. Right? Basically, I'm leaving kind of 35% kind of on the table of quote unquote sort of free energy. You look at what is the main thing that drives that, primarily CO2. So if I can get this bigger differential between those two by paradoxically locally having more CO2, I can give off more oxygen. So that's kind of the theory behind it. It's after that, I would say it gets extremely debatable if it's really true or not. I've talked to some high-end physiologists who are like, yeah, that makes sense. Other people are like, no, it's total bullshit.
Yeah, totally.
I have noticed by doing more nasal breathing, my desaturation has actually gotten a lot better, right? So if I limit how much air is being exchanged in and out, I'm building up a little bit higher levels of CO2. It does appear that those sensors, which are located in the brain and the brainstem, do tend to adjust or readjust to normal levels over time, so that I can feel better having a little bit higher levels of CO2. So not sure if the theory is 100% solid, but it seems to make sense. And in my experience, it appears to work, but maybe in 10 years, we'll find that was just a cool story and that was it. I don't know.
Yeah, right, exactly. Cool. So as far as breath work, is there anything that you recommend for people that are like, because it is becoming more and more popular, and I think like the kind of people hit me up all the time, actually. They just don't know where to begin. Is there anywhere that you suggest people begin that journey?
Oh, man. So where I start people with is if they're really high stress and they're just like ADD squirrels and can't focus on anything, and they've tried breath work before and they just can't seem to do it, I do actually start them with more like a Wim Hof type breathing, which is actually supraventilation. So for people who aren't familiar, it's a really fast cadence, in and out really fast. What you're doing is that's actually kind of a sympathetic stressor. But what I find is if they do 3 or 4 rounds of that, and they kind of do that real fast and they do some type of hold, during the period where they're holding, whether they do it on a full exhale or full inhale, it's debatable, it depends on what you want to do. It's probably the first time in their life that they actually got quiet. It's like the first time I ever did this. Mike Bledsoe walked me through a bunch of stuff probably 4 years ago now. And I remember laying there for, 35 seconds going, I'm not even breathing. And it was probably the first time in my life I actually felt like I got really quiet. And I think that I've kind of walked people through in person with that experience, and just getting them to that point to be like, hey, you can get to a point where you can be pretty quiet, just so they get that experience, even if it's only a few seconds. I think that's kind of worth the price of admission with that. So I'll say, okay, let's do, kind of Wim Hof type stuff for 5 rounds. And at the end of that, I want you just to lay there and just breathe as quiet as you can, right? Pretend you're a corpse. You're just barely breathing, but do it in a relaxed fashion. And having that kind of period afterwards where they're more relaxed, over time, I'll start removing some of the Wim Hof stuff ahead of time. And now, can they get into that more relaxed state a lot faster? I think that is beneficial over time, because I really don't want to be driving their sympathetics all the time. But I found without having them feel that experience, it was like they don't believe it exists. And so their compliance was just absolutely crappy. Once I could feel that, they're like, oh, that's what quiet is. Like, okay, so now they call it like the Zen style, sit and stare at a tree for 20 minutes. Can you kind of replicate that state by just sitting there and just not doing anything really? You know, because one of the guys we worked with in Costa Rica was a Zen priest, was Ben's dad,
Oh, cool.
Mr. Kim. And he was super helpful. And it's fascinating to me how it's so profound, but yet so simple, right? So Zen style is basically just kind of sit there, eyes open, kind of gaze at a spot in front of you, don't move. That's about it. That's about all the instruction you get.
Yeah,
you spend the rest of your lifetime like just
trying to figure it out.
That. Yeah. So I find by doing that little bit of an intro to the spectrum to get people to feel what it's like, and then kind of peeling back from that, I've gotten a little bit more benefit from that. And then I do some stuff in person, or they can do like reflexive performance reset, kind of get them to mechanically breathe better. Because what I find with a lot of people is their breathing mechanics are all sort of hosed up, that for them just to even do better breathing techniques, they don't get a lot of benefit from it, because their scalenes are tight, their neck is super tight, their rib cage is fixed. So they don't have the kind of mechanical competency to get the full benefit from it. So if we give them some drills, or in here, like Minnesota, I can do some hands-on work on them. I'll spend like just 45 minutes to sometimes 2 hours just trying to get their breathing much better. And you see some crazy shit with that. When I worked on some people in Costa Rica, people would sit up and they're like, oh my God, like look at all the colors. There's beautiful colors in here. And their eyes are going every which way. And because now they can take in a full breath. They can exhale CO2. They're not as sympathetic as they were before, right? And so, as you know, if we just drop your heart rate, you get more sensory input in. We jack your heart rate up super high, you get that kind of tunnel vision where your brain is just focused on that immediate threat. So if I have a chance to do that in person, that's what I'll do with people, so that now mechanically they can do it. And then when they go in and do the drills are so much more effective, because they can mechanically get that better movement, and they can actually downregulate.
Yeah, and for people listening to this, if you're at all interested in breath work, that Wim Hof method is something that I've added to my daily practice. And essentially, it's like you do about 30 deep breaths, and then you go to a 2-minute breath lock. And you just struggle with it. At first, your breath hold will be like crap. It'll be like 30 seconds or something. And you just get better. But every day, like look forward to it, because that first breath lock after the first set of breath, it's like the whole world melts away instantly. That's exactly what I thought of when you were talking about Ryan Holiday's books, Stillness is Key, or whatever it's called.
Stillness.
Stillness.
And I think getting people to experience that, and that's a pretty fast way to do it. I find that once they get it, it's like, oh, that's the state I'm trying to get to. Oh, okay.
Totally. And it's so much easier to map yourself back to a feeling,
Totally. Yeah. 100%.
Cool. So something else you posted a while back, you were working out in your driveway in the middle of winter with your shirt off. I just want to talk a little bit about that, because it is still winter here. And now, I guess we're in the midst of this pandemic. And so people don't have so much access to things, but there's still a lot of good old fashioned discomfort out there. What do you find to be the benefit of some of that work that you were doing? Was it kind of novelty for the post, or do you really find some physiological benefit in that work?
I think there is a benefit to it. So how I got into it is, so I did some stuff with metabolic flexibility we'll talk about. So how your metabolism can use both fats and carbohydrates. How can it switch back and forth between the two main fuel sources? And then for a long time, I started thinking, okay, so what do we do with people who, their sleep's pretty dialed in, nutrition's good, their exercise is good, their stress is, kind of manageable. What is sort of like the next level? Like, how would you figure out what are those physiologic systems you should target, right? Because I'm always thinking like my background was I did master's in mechanical engineering. So I'm always thinking like kind of a systems type level. And I'm like, okay, so we think that the body is survival based, which is my bias, right? Your body is just hardwired to do anything to survive. That may come at a cost for your long-term longevity or that type of thing, but your body is constantly figuring out, okay, what's the best thing to do in order to survive? What's the best thing?
Like always,
and then you go,
survival
okay,
first.
Yeah, exactly. And you go, okay, so how do we measure that? Like, what would be a good proxy for all these different things that could be related to survival? How long could you go without that particular thing, right? So if you do that, then you're like, well, first thing people think of like as food. Yeah, food's important, but there's been a guy who did a medically supervised fast for like well over a year. And he lost about 110 pounds, but you're looking at days to months maybe for food. Okay, water, yeah, maybe days, unless you're in extreme environment, stuff like that. Ooh, what's the record for a breath hold? Ooh, minutes, right? So back to the breathing discussion. So breathing, obviously, I think is probably one of the big leverage points for that. So the next level then would be related to survival. What things are the body going to constantly hold within a very, very tight margin? And it's going to do almost everything possible to hold it within that tight margin, right? Yeah. And things you come up with, the main one's going to be temperature. Right? 98.6, we can't have our core temperature deviate very much from that. pH is another one, right? Blood pH has to be held really, really tight within a set range. Maybe we could toss like blood glucose in there. So those kind of things are what I call like kind of homeostatic regulators, right? So these are things that have to function well in the body. And fascinatingly enough, even in disease states, the body will still try to hold them super tight. Right, you get some crazy fever because you get some type of infection. Yes, your temperature will spike up, but we're talking like a couple degrees. It's not going from like 98.6 to 110, right? It's still holding that super tight. I'm like, okay, so maybe those are targets that we should do some type of training. What has been removed with modern society? Well, if we go back to temperature, we spend most of our time in like perfectly controlled temperature. I have people who live in Arizona yell at me like, how dare you live in Minnesota? That must be so miserable. I'm like, but you guys just run from one air-conditioned place to another in the summer. You know, is it really that different than being here in cold in the middle of winter? Probably not. So I think temperature is one of those homeostatic regulators. So then it's pretty hard to measure core temperature. It's probably not going to change all that much.
Yeah, you
but can we go from very hot to very cold? And ideally take something that would be a stressor and make it more of a eustress, a stress that can be beneficial. And the great part with temperature is it's very, very easy to control, right? So just like lifting weights, right? If you can only deadlift 135, cool, start with 135, right? You can scale it down to wherever you're at. So with temperature, we can change the temperature and we can change the medium, right? Is it air or is it water? How fast is pulling heat away? And then the other part I got interested in was, I wonder sometimes if like modern life is just too easy, right? Because humans do better with some type of controlled stress kind of within what they could adapt to. So obviously exercise is something, but I'm like, there's something I could do every day that's mentally very hard, but I could do it on a daily basis, right? Exercise is one of those, maybe some short-term high intensity exercise, stuff like that. But that has kind of a limit, right? You still have to worry about recovery, things like that. I'm like, oh, what if I could expose myself to cold, right? And as long as I'm not an idiot about it, it never really feels good, right? It never really gets to the point where you're like, oh yes, I'm so stoked to do this.
It doesn't.
Even turning the water to cool at the end of a shower, I'm always like, it's gonna suck again. This is like day 91 that I've done this, but it's still gonna suck.
Yeah.
And then once you're done, you're like, it wasn't so bad. So I think cold is one of those things where, from both the physiology and a mindset standpoint, can I get myself to be like, okay, it's go time. We're going to do this thing that's hard. It's not really going to impair our recovery all that much. It may actually even benefit us. But can you kind of train your brain to be like, okay, it's go time. We're doing the hard thing. It's going to be better. So long term, you're looking past kind of that sort of acute suffering, so to speak. And I do think there's some interesting data on that in terms of possibly modifying the immune system, everything from brown adipose tissue to a bunch of other stuff. But I think upregulating those kind of homeostatic regulators is a benefit. If you want to look in the literature on this, you can look at something like hormesis is kind of the new fancy term that's tossed around. Hormesis means that there has to be some type of damage before the body can respond. And what we find is the body doesn't even have to be damaged before it can respond. Right? At some point, I could do a bicep curl, probably not damage a lot of muscle fibers, but I could still probably get stronger. Right? So if you look up something called adaptive homeostasis or homeostatic, basically it's adaptive homeostasis. And one of the theories is Kelvin Davies is that over time, we have this big buffer we build up in our physiologic systems, whether it's response to cold, response to stress, all this sort of things. And with aging, that buffer kind of goes away. And we're now less responsive as an organism than what we were before, and all into different physiologic responses. So maybe if we do some cold exposure, we do some other things that change our pH, like doing some hard lactate, based work, or maybe some hyperventilation breathing or opposite type of breathing. We're doing things with periods of fasting, periods of high amounts of glucose. Can we control for both of those? I think that allows your body to just be a more robust human being. And we've kind of evolved with a lot of those challenges. And with modern environment, we've kind of been pulling those out. And we don't really know to what extent or how beneficial they are. I think you can make a very good argument that at minimum, they are definitely going to be beneficial if done in a controlled manner. How beneficial, I'd say, is probably still up for debate. That was a long-winded answer.
No, it's perfect. I think it's great because I do believe, there's the physiological and then there's also the psychological benefit of doing this kind of thing. And, for people that are listening to this, it's like if you're even considering some kind of special program, like the psychological component for you is going to be like your physiology will run out. I promise you, whatever you are, no matter what, like you can be an Olympic athlete, but day 3, it's like you're going to be so broken that it's going to become very psychological. And I see like a lot of benefit when facing the cold is actually just using the directive mind to be like, no, I am doing that, right? It does suck and I'm doing it, and like forcing yourself into it. And just learning the ability to do that with your mind, I think is massively lost in our society today.
Yeah, because at a base level, all organisms are designed to avoid pain.
Totally.
Right? And we can cognitively override that for a short period of time. And I think you'd probably agree. I think that's a skill. Right? Yes. It's like, okay, we're going to do a 2K on the road today, and it's going to suck moose balls. It's going to be horrible, but you're going to do it. Are you really going to die? Probably not. Are you going to get injured? Probably not, as long as you're not a complete idiot.
Right.
But it's still going to suck really bad. And can you get yourself to do those things when you have to? Okay, today's test day. We've been training for 8 weeks. All right, it's go time. Let's go. And it's crazy all the weird stuff that your mind will come up with just not to do
it. Right. Totally. Yeah, that's exactly it. So people that are listening to this are also going to get an offer to your Metabolic Flexibility cert, I believe it is.
Correct.
So with this cert or with Metabolic Flexibility, how do we start just leveraging that in our day-to-day training? Like where's the squeeze in that juice for us? The juice in that squeeze.
Yeah, so metabolic flexibility is how well can we use carbohydrates on one end and how well can we use fats on the other end. And probably not this audience, but I would say the average stereotypical American, probably not the best with carbohydrates, but has probably a fair amount of influx with them. But they're also not really doing a lot of exercise, not really a lot of movement. So for them, exercise, movement is going to be the big key. Probably dropping carbohydrates a little bit may be beneficial. I think also on the other end, what do you do things to increase your body's use of fat? Exercise, again, obviously going to be very helpful. Sleep, very helpful. And then periods of fasting are extremely beneficial. We look at hormonally what happens with fasting. By fasting is just a period of time where you're not having any calories come in. I know there's all bazillions of different definitions now of intermittent fasting, but fasting, period of time where you're not consuming any calories. So for most people, unless you did too much Ambien and you're making bacon and eggs at 3 a.m, sleep is a period of time where you're actually fasted. So now can we take that and extend it maybe a little bit longer? So I like to have people work up to 1 day per week And this could take them 6 to 8 weeks to work up to it. Do about a 19 to 24-hour fast, right? Just don't consume anything that has calories. I think that's going to be very beneficial. I've been doing this with clients since almost 11 years ago now. Most people, if they take that 6 to 8 week period, just 1 day a week of pushing out food a little bit, will be able to do it. It's kind of a mental exercise. And then over time, that becomes relatively easy. And I think that's a good way with basically what you're doing is insulin. It starts here and so it starts dropping down. And when insulin is lower, it's going to push your body to use more fat as a fuel. So I think that's probably a pretty good entry point for a lot of people. So if they haven't done, let's say a 19 to 24-hour fast, working up to that, I think is going to be very beneficial, both on the physiology side and also the mental side. And then you also realize that, oh, I don't really need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. Oh, I might be a little bit hungry, but I'm actually going to be okay. And for people who are in the military, I'll take that even to another level of, at some point, I want them to do all their normal training, like on a 19 to 24-hour fast. In some cases, we may go even a little bit longer. Not that they're going to need to do that all the time, but I think to have the mental capacity to know that you've done that in training, and if the shit were hit the fan and like you can't eat for 24 hours, you're like, oh, not that bad. I've done that before in training. I hit all my metrics, hit all my exercise performance, whatever my job was. And I think just knowing that you've done that and you've actually literally trained your body to be able to do that is super beneficial, both from a physiology and a mental side too.
If you have coffee, does it break that fast?
I don't think so, as long as it's black coffee.
Black coffee.
Yeah, that gets into all sorts of stuff of, are you trying to upregulate autophagy and cell cleaning and all that kind of stuff? And I'm just mainly looking at it from a fuel usage standpoint. So as long as there's nothing with calories, you're probably going to be fine. Of course, then you get people who are like, oh, but if I put coconut oil in my coffee, technically that's only a fat and it doesn't have an insulin release. So right. Is that okay? And it's like, just drink black coffee.
1 day a week, like you're fine. Yeah.
1 day a week, you're going to be fine. Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually incredible that you say that. And just for people that are listening to this, I've spent, because I spent 12 years in the military in a special forces capacity, I did for a very long time. Every Monday, I just eat on Mondays. So I think that's how I did my 24-hour fast. And there were many situations where I found myself at work in a mission that had gone haywire and felt just so adapted and like keyed in, and my performance didn't crash. And so I think that's just incredible advice for this audience, for anyone that's considering that route.
Yeah, and years ago I gave a talk to DARPA on this, right? So Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was basically about metabolic flexibility, and my whole kind of takeaway was, yes, one of the weak points of any operation is all the infrastructure that has to come with it, right? Obviously, the more people you have, the more infrastructure you have. So if you have a smaller group of people, could you train them ahead of time, if it's a short mission, to maybe get by on just fats they could bring with themselves, or less calories, or try to source stuff locally. And again, you talk to people who do this, they kind of intuitively know that and kind of do it anyway. But could we do more training and research in that area to see how far could you actually push that, right? So instead of dropping people off into a situation that they may not be metabolically prepared for, can we train them ahead of time so that they are both metabolically prepared and kind of mentally, like, oh yeah, I've done this shooting task, not eating for 24 hours, and I did just as good as when I was fed. Right? Oh, okay, there's no food around. Okay, I'm gonna be fine for, I know at least 24 hours, I'm probably gonna be okay. A buddy of mine who got deployed over to the Southeast Asia region for a while with like 5 other people, he didn't really tell me what he was doing or what they were doing over there or whatever, and I didn't ask. I asked him, I said, hey, how did it go? He's like, we're only there for like 4 days, and it was just, kind of a training mission. And he's like, I did great. He's like, oh, I noticed you said you did great. That implies the other guys with you didn't do so great. He's like, yeah, they were in the bathroom for like the first like 2 days. They said their guts were not used to eating, local food. And He's like, oh, I was eating off of street vendors and whatever else I could find. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. He's like, yeah, I took your concept of metabolic flexibility and I was practicing this for like 9 months. So you would have like, he purposely dirtied up his diet and would eat like things he wouldn't have normally not eaten. He's like, well, I could be deployed to some weird region and I wanted to make sure I could handle, you know, all different types of food, and just, I mean, he took it to like the nth degree.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder too, right? And again, perfectly anecdotal, the people I've seen in other training missions where they're like super controlled, like they come to you, they're like, man, I'm super on point. I got all my supplements in row and I got all my stuff. I got my 9 hours of sleep. And then you realize that once they go out for a training mission, they're like, oh my God, all my shit fell apart. I don't know what happened. It's like, that was the first exposure you had to that, right? Even MREs or God knows whatever else. And
Yeah.
I think there is a training component to get ready to do that. And again, that doesn't mean you're going to live the rest of your life doing that. But can you go from, you know, if you have access to really good, clean food and lots of it, yeah, you probably want to take advantage of that. If you're out in the middle of God knows where with, you know, tin cans full of something they call food, you probably still got to be able to function that way. And maybe you should train that way once in a while just to keep that, you know, broad ends of capacity going.
Totally. And I think really that like ties in almost everything we've talked about. It's like exposing yourself to these different types of adversity, whether it's cold, whether it's the way that you're eating. It ensures that you're not so much of a liability, you know? And
Totally.
that's the real thing, is like you get out there. It doesn't matter what your bench press is if you're a fucking liability and you're huddled over a toilet and can't perform, you know?
Yeah.
Or your
and it's usually crashing. Like little things like that people don't think of, which to me is like it's fascinating, right? To think that, oh, some little pathogen, little tiny little thing, and it just, can just wreak havoc on you really fast.
Shuts our whole country down.
Yeah.
do you find that fasted cardio regularly is a way to get this metabolic flexibility, to teach yourself to burn fat, or are you really just burning up the glycogen stores you have?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of fasted cardio. I know in the fitness world that's like hotly debated, and
sure,
I'm not as much of a fan of it for pure body comp reasons. I think the research on that's very, very split, although I do think it may help, right? There's only one study that's really done it in a controlled fashion. But what I like is, okay, so if I'm going to do lower to moderate intensity cardio, one, I don't need carbohydrates for the main fuel. I actually want to teach the body to use more fat. So I'll do that in a fasted condition, right? So lower levels of insulin, pushing the body to use more fat. The caveat to that is that you want to make sure and modify the intensity. So it should be lower to moderate intensity. So I'm a big fan of doing that, building up some type of aerobic base for longer periods of time. You know, mitochondria are all like the new crazy fancy word, little powerhouses of cell, even though they do a bunch of stuff beyond that. That's primarily dictated by aerobic volume, right? So how much volume of aerobic training can you get in? And mitochondria are really good at using fat for fuel. So the more of those little guys you have, the better off you're going to be. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that. And then on the flip side, you know, if you're going to do a 500 meter on the rower, you're going to do an all-out sprint, or you're going to do some crazy-ass Metcon or something that's really hard, you want the ability to use carbohydrates to their, you know, fullest degree, because that's going to allow you the highest speed and power. Because I think sometimes people, not you, but people in fitness are like extremely bipolar, right? They're like, oh, fat's like the best fuel ever. Use fat all the time. Like, yeah, until you need to do a Wingate, then you're going to suck ass.
Right.
And they're like, oh, no, it's only carbs. Carbs are the best fuel ever. Like, well, what if you've been training for a while and you're doing a 19 to 24-hour fast? Man, you really want the ability to use fat. And if you're doing a low to moderate, long duration stuff, man, using fat is going to be much more advantage to your favor. So again, it's using both fuels. It's just, what are you trying to accomplish at that time? So lower to moderate intensity, I think fat's a better fuel. If you gotta, you know, go out and do some speed and power and drop the hammer, like using muscle glycogen and carbohydrates is a big advantage.
Totally. And, you know, you correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like when you have the ability to do both, you're far less likely to be hangry as well.
Yeah. And that's what was fascinating to me, because once I started doing more fasting, even like today, I haven't really eaten that much, kind of on purpose, but I'm a little hungry, but it's not that bad. If I fast forward and go backwards in time, 15 years, like when I first started doing some of this stuff, I had, used to eating every 2 to 3 hours. Man, if it was 4 hours during the day and I hadn't eaten, I was not a fun person to be around.
Totally.
Blood glucose probably did some weird stuff. I didn't measure it then, but I just not very metabolically flexible and just not a very resilient human.
Yeah, that's the way to put it. Not very resilient.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people that pride themselves on being really mentally tough, but if you like miss a meal, they fall apart, or there's so many things. But yeah, I think that's a huge component of it, is making yourself more resilient.
Yeah, and I think to me, even people who are after all-out performance and even now longevity and health are kind of the big things.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're just more resilient, you can get probably to the highest level of both of those, right? I think you can get a very high component of health and a very high level of performance. And that's where I find most people want to be. Yeah, if you're an elite athlete, maybe you'll sacrifice and put your health in a box and shove it under your bed. But, most people still want to kind of get through what they're doing and have a really high level of performance, and they don't really want to completely tank their health in the process either.
Totally. Is there anything else that you wanted to get to that we haven't talked about today?
No, I think that's probably pretty good. It covers kind of a wide variety from metabolic flexibility, kind of all the way up the ladder to physiologic flexibility and back down. So yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, totally. And I think, for people listening, using those things as a way to leverage the psyche, that will make you much better in whatever adverse environment you put yourself into. So this was an enlightening conversation. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the good questions and all the experience and everything. I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks, guys.